What if the first Sumerian cities were built around something already buried? I will walk with you across layers and measures, not to tell you what was, but to show you what the record guarded. Where are you, and what time is it? Stay with this quiet. Subscribe if you intend to return. Touch the ritual bell of attention. I will unfold slowly, one stratigraphic cut at a time, letting the silence between finds speak. This is a guide's promise. Slow unfolding, patient steps, no premature closure. You grow up with the certainty that all cities begin where the people gathered first, that habitation springs from necessity, that settlement clusters where life once pooled in the hollow of the land. It is an old belief, so weighty in its repetition that it becomes invisible, part of the scaffolding of how you imagine the past arranging itself. A city's heart, surely it must be a consequence of accumulated footsteps, laughter, sleeping bodies, bread broken and water drawn, the patient growth of floor upon floor, refuse mingled with routine, the organic layering of human presence pressed down by seasons and cycles. You trust the familiar formula. At the center, life, radiating outward, its aftershocks. The trench does not comply. The surface is hard-packed, a living memory of some final smoothing. Beneath it, a measured thickness of clay, compacted with a deliberateness that escapes the incidental. Field notebooks register the trowel's dull scrape, the hush between passes, the resistance of earth reshaped not by use, but by intention. You wait for debris, for the scatter of occupation, a hearth, the brittle scatter of vessels, a child's lost bead. Instead, the record holds quiet. Layer by layer, the section profile tells its own quiet story. The mound does not reveal a jumble of living, no churned soils and sudden stains, no charred ash where fires once flickered. Instead, sealed plains repeat themselves. Each boundary is marked by a new deposit foundation, trenches stuffed precisely with imported clay, then buried and cast over with new floors, unmixed and unwavering. The field notes accumulate in their own ritual, recording, compacted clay lens, sealed horizon, no penetration below. The catalogue of absence grows dense, a silence that is palpable in every measured square. Pottery shards wait embedded within fill, never sinking lower than this calculated strata. They date each act of resurfacing, yet none breach the core that lies beneath. Assemblages cluster at infill boundaries, their shapes and tempers telling only of moments when the surface was renewed, not of life lived in place. No scatter, no thresholds scored by repeated passage, no rubble from collapsed walls compacted by time. Instead, the record presents a closed sequence, deliberate, cumulative, quiet. You pause over the field drawing, pencil lines shadowing what the eye finds. The reinterpretation of center, a mass built not by gathering but by guarding. Outside the core, the city sprawls, its accumulation moving outward and upward as if in slow retreat from whatever sleeps at the heart. Trenches press against the preserved core, cut after careful cut, but the mound endures, sealed at every phase. Each generation of builders layered their own closure with a finality that refuses entry. The act is repeating, predictable in its rigor, but opaque in meaning, an archive that omits, a narrative of what will not yield. Nothing infiltrates below the measured horizon. Thousands of footsteps skirt the mound, never breaching it. Layers rise, each a tide on a static shore. Memory, if it exists, has been flattened into the compaction of things left deliberately out of reach. Circles sketched on survey maps record only the outermost extent, while the center remains a gap documented by precision, unexcavated by intention, avoided in the pivot of trench lines. Even the act of digging becomes a negotiation with silence, an encounter with preservation arranged not by chance but by consistent restraint. Present clues only to the fidelity of process, offering pits suppressed under clay, not marked by exuberance but by the careful layering of absence, each a note in the score of covering up. The pattern is enduring, uniform in its quietness. The archive grows heavier, not with what it reveals, but with each new addition to what is left unseen. Architectural lines radiate away from the center, confirming the decision to expand the city by enveloping rather than exposing. The mound ascends, mute and undisturbed, at the cost of constant renewal. Trenches reveal, but only at the boundary. No domestic layer, no habitation trace reaches below the compacted plain. What lies beneath is not absent, simply closed. You stand, instrument in hand, and measure a presence that rearranges expectation. In the shift light of evening, even the dust seems drawn to the surface, settling as a shroud. There is a tension here, caught in the archival pause. A city centered not on openness, but on protection, on the perpetual sealing of something never mentioned outright. Record-keeping floods the silence, but the void at the center grows heavier with every entry made, every context bagged and left blank. Accumulation here is not organic, but studied and upward and outward flowering from a place left intentionally in shadow. You write your notes beside the trench edge, hands steady, gaze returning to the compact surface over and over, as if waiting for the earth at last to break its fast. Yet the mound yields only in contour, not in content. Dust, stone, silence, memory. Each layer is a curtain, drawn and redrawn, archive built to last by omission more than inclusion. What was located here, and why was it left sealed? The inherited account is deceptively settled. Temples stone-framed, rising out of dust stand, we are told, as backdrops for a living multitude. The architecture is open, procedural, destined for movement and congregation beneath high beams. The prevailing assumption is silent in its confidence. All acts within these precincts are gestures towards an audience, real or imagined, with ritual as an unbroken bridge between the living and the sacred. Foundation deposits, it is said, are the initial offerings pressed into service, a contract underfoot, messages sent to roots as guardians and witnesses. This belief is a veneer, repeated with a certain calm, a world in which every hidden thing awaits a future encounter. But the surfaces of record do not always mirror the ease of accepted narrative. In the quiet of the trench, under the knotted shade of scaffolding, a different register takes shape. There is a ledger of observations, one compiled in earth, slowly, with the patience of sediment. Here, the evidence does not announce itself, yet its persistence cannot be ignored. Beneath thresholds, under the heavy hush of stone plinths, there are caches, not encountered by accident, but found through deliberate incision. Each gives way to a small world, unlit, close, and unyielding. The pit is prepared. Its cut is precise, dimensions marked in the margin of a field notebook. The cavity, once open, is lined or rough-hewn. Then comes the fill. Repeated sets of small objects, each selected, yet refusing to differentiate itself from its predecessors. Beads cluster, forming muted constellations. Tools worn and silent rest in juxtaposition. Animal bone fragments, their origins unrevealed, nestle in the clay. Often they are sealed within clay, the surface pressed with a signet or seal, a quiet assertion of identity, unobtrusive yet determined. The seal impressions linger with their own language, not as an invitation to decipher, but as the final gesture before forgetting. Each cache is encased, its boundaries marked as absolute. The closure is methodical. Lids imposed, the margins pinched or tamped, the surface compacted until no gap remains. There is no trace of reopening. Stratigraphic drawings describe fills untouched, their compaction confirmed by the indent of each layer. The deposits sink deeper into memory, left as records far more permanent than any inscription above ground. The inventories reproduce themselves in calm repetition. Objects recur with persistent exactness. The list does not grow, nor does it diminish. By design or habit, the arrangement holds steady, an echo moving through unopened earth. Field notes annotate the presence of chambers, sometimes more than one, sometimes in serial order, always beneath what would become an unwalked surface. The chambers, sharply defined, reveal no breach in their outline, no hint that the deposit was ever meant to be revisited or replenished. Room is left for nothing. The intention is not stated, only inferred through a careful reading of absence. One is left with the sensation of enforced withdrawal. Ritual, as commonly framed, is open-ended, a cycle of renewal, interaction, and return. Here, the opposite logic is at work. The act is terminal. Once closed, the deposit defines a limit. Its presence is anchored under stone so heavy, so deliberately placed, that recovery or even recognition would become impossible without violence to the structure above. The floor is poured, compacted, polished, smooth. Over time, this surface acquires its own silence. No footprint disturbs it. No ceremony marks its renewal. The field notation ends at the margin. The record ceases. Only the absence prevails, layered and inviolate. The tension does not resolve. It is pressed, instead, into the distinction between public and private, between the act that invites participation and the envelope that denies it. The cache beneath the threshold, so carefully constituted, so meticulously sealed, is not addressed to witness or supplicant. It is a form of memory immune to retrieval, a gesture finished before it is registered, an archive locked before it is catalogued. The evidence sits outside narrative, outside the open rhythms of ritual life. Dust settles on the stone. The documentation is folded closed, labelled, and stored, but the question does not fade. The record is always partial. The soil is returned, the line is drawn. In time, all that endures is the sequence of observations. The sealed chamber, the unbroken fill, the cluster of objects encased in restless clay. The rest dissolves into the quiet of a floor never meant to be crossed. Who buried these things to remain unreachable? The accepted arrangement is persistent, quietly echoing through field protocols and scholarly habit. That rooms closed with purpose are at last reopened, that architectural thresholds bricked and caulked with clay surrender to later utility, and that cycles of use and repair are the default movement of place. This movement, methodical and slow, is reflected in decades of excavation. A presumption of doors reopened, passages unsealed, chambers again revealed to light and air. It is the rhythm of habit, barely questioned, reinforcing itself each time a wall falls away or a threshold is traced by a hesitant brush, as though access is our inheritance and cycles are inevitable, returning always to an invitation of entry. But evidence on the ground begins to resist this easy cadence. Not loudly, not through spectacle or rupture, but by the quiet accumulations of detail. Field logs, resting in their dark drawers, inventory entrances meticulously sealed, documented, and left so. There are doorways, not only closed but bricked tight, surfaces pressed with neat lumps of unbaked clay. Their pale faces bearing matrix impressions, corded marks, almost a negative of intention left behind in the dull material. Molds are clearly numbered in hurried handwriting, their sequence unbroken, cross-referenced in catalogues, not for dramatic discovery, but for the silence of absence, an absence of disturbance, of hands returning, of later tools seeking re-entry. On the stratigraphic sheets, names repeat. Sealed closure, bricked door, clay locket. Layer codes are concise, the notations precise, unembellished. Sealed doors are not listed merely as architectural features, but as a subtle kind of terminus. Overlying strata, sifted grain by grain, show no breach. No sign that the closure was ever reworked. The matrix holds, undisturbed from the day pressure was laid upon wet clay, until now, when observation itself is the only incursion. Lines trace the boundary. Numbers denote the compressive history. There is no signal of intrusion above, merely the sustained, unpracticed patience of settlement dust, and sherds folded gently down over closure, a slow, dry forgetting. Recorded in the neutral colour of technical description, girds the impression that what was once closed remained so. Clay seals are measured, the radius reflecting the cupped palm, the thickness calibrated in millimeters, a record of pressure and duration. Cordage impressions traverse the soft surfaces, fibers caught in their own undoing, perhaps unspooling briefly before settling into the forever night behind the wall. Stones packed tight are nothing expressive, merely the repetition of craft, gapless, resistant, slid into place with patient, deliberate force. There are no hesitation marks, no thin lines of later probing. Each surface is whole and cold, the material memory of imposed finality. Notes accumulate, always returning to the state of preservation. The seals, it is observed, are unbroken, not once breached nor carelessly grazed. Even the most minor of sealings maintain their record. The thin lines of cord, the patterns transferred from bone implements, the shallow stamps of fingernail or tool end, every observable closure is an assertion of the moment it was finished, an impression frozen, unmarred by the soft, crumbling fingerprints of future hands. Each observer, present by duty, marks this stasis in the record, the repetition of intact condition, entered in catalogues, restated in reports, left for reassessment by the next silent reader. Yet something subtle refracts here, a tension gathering in the interstices between intention and result. If closure was, as once presumed, provisional, an invitation delayed, a gesture toward future return, then where is the evidence of this return? None is given. Instead, the arrangement the unbroken seals suggests less a pause than an end, a long, deliberate terminality. The idea gathers weight, filling the room with a dense, almost tangible quiet. It is preservation, but ambiguous in motive, not purely mnemonic, not purely prohibitive. Every intact seal oscillates between memory kept and boundary enforced. Is the door bricked to remind, or to warn, to hold something in or keep it out? There is no answer within the walls, only ongoing records of restraint, the trace of choice, fossilized in clay and stone, an exclusion that resists even the acknowledgement of its own purpose. So the record folds into itself, layer upon layer. Dust accumulates, a grey, dry palimpsest. Footsteps echo and fade. The inked sheets are refiled, their edges softened by decades, then centuries of silent handling. The sealed rooms persist, both object and absence. What remains is not the knowledge of what is denied, but the persistence of denial itself. The spaces carefully kept apart, the entry forever deferred, the ritual of documentation outlasting even the memory of the act it records. In the quiet after, under the pressure of weight and forgetting, you are left only with the rectangle of bricked entrance, the impression in clay, the unyielding stonework, and above all the certainty that no re-entry ever came. Was thereby permanently excluded? It begins as an expectation, unspoken yet rehearsed across hundreds of excavations. Where people gather, they leave behind evidence of living a halo of refuse, so familiar as to be almost inevitable. Inhabitants press themselves into the earth in layers of bone and potsherd, littering middens along the lines of daily movement and need. Archaeologists approach habitations attuned to the rhythm of disposal. They map the ordinary outcome of shared proximity, waste that collects and radiates outward from the center, like the ghostly signature of life long withdrawn. Yet, in the silence after the pick and trowel, another pattern emerges. Survey maps, laid flat beneath lamplight, betray a geometry unexpected. The refuse is cast not inward but aside. Peripheral concentrations cluster at the margins, forming a broken perimeter. Hearths, ringed by shadows, recede from the core. Butchery debris, splintered bone, red-stained grit, lies scattered in alleys and along the furthest paths, not among hearthstones or beneath timber lintels. At the heart, a vacancy persists. This central precinct, marked boldly on the site plan in ink, commands attention through its remarkable cleanliness. What is seen, upon drawing close, is less an absence than a precise maintenance. The plan records cobbled surfaces pressed into geometric attention, stones aligned so that the line of each gap echoes some earlier intent. Along the lichen-edged flags, fine sweep marks are traced delicate but persistent, passing in parallel lines or gentle arcs. The flags themselves, pressed flat by countless quiet steps, reveal little of the organic irregularities that define the world beyond the bordering shadows. There is a compactness, a solidity delivered by time and attention, held beneath the weather and dust of lost years. The soil, submitted in handfuls and spoons to laboratory record, yields a forensic layer. Under floors within the central boundary, the count is low. Organic content barely registers. The numbers come through, each digit a minor silence, confirming restraint rather than accumulation. Further out, at the periphery, readings spike. High phosphate lingers in the substrate, the inevitable residue of living bodies waste and upturned fire, blood, and rot. The contrast is more than arithmetic. It is a differential preserved across centuries. Central floors remain unrealistically lean in their records, the markers of ordinary, untidy life trimmed away. Photographs, housed in battered field folders, capture the contrast before memory further fails. Swept courtyards retain an almost deliberate order. Their stone contours maintain a subtle brightness against the grime and soil encroaching from all directions. In the corners, where the edge gives way to alley, sweeps of dirt collect. Debris intervenes at the margins, softened by wind, pressed by occasional feet but never quite allowed to migrate across the threshold. The divide persists in image as much as in soil. Even now, decades from exposure, the distinction is felt not only in sight, but in the quiet conviction that something essential has been withheld from the center, preserved out of ordinary reach. This accumulation of quiet, this slow gathering of discrepancy, works upon the shared assumptions of excavation. The notion of a lived-in heart, vital, messy, formative, draws into question under the cool weight of evidence. Was it always so orderly, or was order imposed? Did life shift, slowly, away from center to margin, or did something in the pattern of practice enforce a boundary, invisible yet binding? What is left after the trowel and measure, after the trays of bone and earth are carted away, is less what filled the center than what was not allowed to remain. Over the flagged stones, it returns with a kind of regularity, a kept secret, pressed into place by ritual or habit, by some unseen necessity. No broken ceramics, no char, no petrous scrap. To walk there, even in imagination, is to sense constraint. The faint echo of sweeping, practiced daily until it formed a discipline. The center stands untouched by daily accretion, its records written in what was consistently refused entrance. The evidence waits uncertain, unresolved, a pattern of exclusion imposed and reimposed. In the margins, life accumulates, but centrally, intention or habit clears the field. As the dust of seasons reforms, the precinct preserves its silence. One is left, archiver or witness, to wonder not only at what was entrusted to stone, but what demanded such preservation. Held the center so clean? We have learned, or perhaps only rehearsed, the comforting idea of the ancient city as a living center, a place whose stone and dust gathered not only the movements of people but the thick, continuous breath of their land. Grain ripening in the open fields, stretches of earth worked in cycles, the hinterlands unbroken from their pulsing core. In this story, the boundaries are porous, and the distinction faint a seamless passage from furrow to street, field to hearth, crops and people coinciding at the heart. Memory inclines us to fill the silences with vitality, to imagine urban hearts with the persistent hum of agriculture, its green insinuations threading through every threshold. However, is less yielding to this vision. Evidence, silent and unadorned, holds its own court. There are the core samples, columns of layered soil drawn up from old ground, each one accruing the fine gradations of time's indifferent accumulation. Phytoliths, mineral whispers from vanished plants caught amid dust. Pollen grains, caught still in the stratified arrangement of buried sediment, each a trace of the world's former flora. Under laboratory light, these are translated into numbers, into ordered counts and grain types, locked to depths marked in neat millimeters. Every increment a record suspended, indifferent to longing or expectation. Peripheral readings, the samples from city margins, maintain familiar patterns. Marked frequencies of cereal pollen, The signs of cultivation held close to the boundary like an embrace. The spectrum is broad: wheat, barley, the weedy companions of settled ground. Domestic weeds rise in numbers, asserting themselves as witnesses to sown ground. And the steady turn of seasons, each layer, each pollen frequency, aligns comfortably with what we think we know. Life crowding the edges, cycles of soil and seed, and then the core. The central samples, taken as if to confirm the same story, offer instead another cadence entirely. Here, the anticipated markers recede. Anthropogenic pollen, those signatures of deliberate cultivation, dwindle to near nothing. A numerical quiet descends. Instead, the slides fill with the unrooted. Dust suspended in glass, wind-borne grains from beyond, spores of saline-tolerant plants finding their way in across distance. The raw numbers, when tabulated, form not a crescendo, but a hollow, an absence made visible. Where the urban heart should pulse with the memory of abundance, it records instead a thinning, a kind of ecological withdrawal. They offer only measured frequency against measured depth. Their graphs slope downward, attenuating, fading. Count after count confirms this quiet, a negative shaped by the repetition of absence. The center is marked not by the remnants of thriving agriculture or the muddle of domesticated soils. It is instead a place where deviation persists. Wind brings in distant traces, but leaves them unanchored. Salts gather. Fine dust accumulates upon itself, layering over years and then centuries, each layer another reflection of what is not found beneath the lens. Controls, checked and rechecked, refuse to conjure evidence. Here, the environment inscribes its own kind of boundary, the sterile, the constrained, the almost untouched by seed or root or remembered harvest. Mute but insistent, it becomes difficult to picture a core filled with tilled ground and scattered growth. When the traces inscribed in sediment contradict the vision so gently and so completely. Instead, what is most readily available is the evidence of refusal, a geography set aside from the everyday cycles of plant and sower. The evidence does not tell why. It does not whisper theories or encourage closure. It only marks time, layer after layer, letting the accumulation of absence become its own archive. One confronts the tension between what was always imagined, half-consciously, as ecological openness, unpenned, unrestrained, green moving to stone and back again, and what is now given, the documentation of sustained blankness, spatial constraint grown into habit or design. Where pollen might have pressed into soil, it did not. Where roots might have grown, they found resistance or antipathy. The city's centre, far from a living node in agricultural time, becomes an estranged hollow, a site where time's residue is not presence, but the patient layering of nothing. Is this the true inheritance of the central cause, a barrenness that resists recovery, meaning ferried only by dust and salt? Does time itself favour absence where we assumed accumulation? The laboratory forms remain, unmarked by speculation, numbers rest, stacked, each part of a structure that holds. Silence extends from the page, from the glass, from the layered soil itself. Memory does not fill these hollows. It crowds only the mind of the observer, who is left again with the long, unbroken question of what it means when a centre is marked, not by what grew, but by what failed to take root. What kept seeds and soil from taking root there? It is an expectation so deeply rooted as to seem self-evident. When the ground is interrogated, its secret contours will unfurl, and the lines in the earth will correspond to walls, to voids, to the clear evidence of ancient architecture. The story repeats across maps, reports, studies. What lies below is simply waiting to rise, certainty trailing the sweep of a brush, the cut of a trench, the steady advance of excavation. Beneath the familiar mounds at the centre of these old foundations, the presumption endures that whatever mystery endures must, in the end, conform to the outlines that measurement can reveal. The silent pact has always been that matter aligns with map, that each anomaly yields eventually to certainty, to disclosure, to the sun. Yet geophysics, in primed and persistent hands, often shades this legacy with uncertainty. The magnetometer surveys, repeated and methodical, move across the surfaces of these mounds in slow, calibrated progress. Sensors hover and drift, their sweep prescribed in long, unbroken paths. Pause at any point along these circuits and fix your attention not on the mound itself, or the city beneath, rather, on the instrument's harvest. The pale notations inscribed across graph paper or encoded digitally, where the language of the subsurface is quietly transcribed into gradients and bands of signal strength. Here, something resists the pattern. At each site, not once but many times, the survey returns the same unquiet anomaly. A central, deep zone of low magnetic response subdued, almost muted, framed on all sides by parameters of higher magnetic clarity. The data accumulates, page upon page. Surveyors in the field, careful in their repetition, walk their grid lines. They note sweep intervals, instrument offsets, atmospheric idiosyncrasies, the angle of sun and chill of morning. The logs are precise. They trace the bearing of each path, record magnetometer calibration, mark pauses and restarts, track the drifting compass as it scans each meter of Earth. There is discipline in this recording. Every traversal over the crown of each mound, every careful repeat, every overlap. The instrument does not falter in its impartiality. The record is measured, unyielding to expectation. Color gradients or cross-hatched ink signal the presence or occlusion. And always, at the center, the same presence-absence, a muted heart, round or elliptical, demarcated by a rim of livelier response. The overlying city is mapped, its features drawn, its ruins categorized. Yet this core, this quietly resonant gap, passes unfathomed. Across the breadth of the reports, the archival voice is unchanging. The maps do not tell more than they record. The scale sits at the sheet's edge, silent, patient. There is a stillness in the evidence that accumulates off the page. Read the equipment logs and scan the appended records, the sweep paths checkmarked, the instrument settings meticulously copied from one day to the next. The absence of further intervention quietly persisted. Line after line, a notational silence descends. No confirmation trenches disrupt the anomaly's core. The area is neither sampled, nor explained, nor cut. The absence is not animated by argument or speculation. It is simply preserved, as if awaiting a time outside the report's remit. The zone holds beneath the ground, undisturbed, a margin of difference resisting the pressure of the known. Elsewhere, soil is broken, artifacts extracted, walls uncovered brick by brick in the light and dust. Here, in the bounded stillness beneath the mound, the surface remains unbroken. No blade, no auger, no spade has pressed into that low-resonance core. The response zone is both mapped and left alone. Even the absence is archived. Blank section profiles, silent footnotes, the circled ambiguity on a figure caption. The absence persists, resisting not just exposure but even the memory of intrusion. You may linger over these records, returning to the shaded maps, the measured profiles, the repetitive certainty of the equipment logs. There is a quiet power in this accumulation of negatives. Every step of observation adds another layer of non-revelation. The documentation itself becomes the threshold, time marked not by what was found, but by what was left untouched by the deliberate withholding of the Earth's voice. The low-response heart claims its own silence by the very act of being noted yet untested. The unresolved anomaly gathers the quiet centuries, carrying forward the pause between sense and intervention. The evidence dreams of structure, of purpose, of something once shaped, and now faded with the centuries' passage. But the only mark on the record is the silence itself, the field's deep hush, the mirrored maps, the careful notation of presence and absence held in the archive. Trust in the trace, in the steady return to what is sensed but not revealed. Could this signal, this circled hush within the ancient mound, ever be more than the sum of its unconfirmed contours? It is sometimes quietly believed, almost incidentally, that ancient precincts were open to the city, that they breathed the same dusty air as the surrounding streets, their boundaries permeable and municipal, a matter of function rather than restriction. The dream of unguarded space recurs, pressed into the margins of memory, where thresholds seem porous and access is assumed, if only as a faint impression. The administrative centres, it is said, manage the flow of goods, people, and routine. The record keepers, with their styluses gripped and concentration lent to repetition, catalogued what passed, and who passed, and what was owed. The belief settles in the dust. These places were open, ordinary, unremarkable in their regulated passage. But this assumption finds itself, gently but indelibly, unsettled by the tablets. Withdrawn from the earth after long silence, administrative tablets have been taken by generations of scholars as neutral records, tables of account, announcements of delivery, protocols of exchange. Their clay surfaces, pressed with careful signs, give up neither urgency nor incident. They tell of measures and quantities, lists and names, the surface record of a world arranged for tracking. Yet epigraphic corpora, catalogued in sequence and time, include more than commerce. Among the regular ledgers and monotone orders lie passages inscribed with another tenor, entries that forbid, that delimit, that conjure the possibility of violation by naming it. The texts speak, not in commands to act, but in prohibitions, quiet, measured, absolute in their articulation. Observe what the tablets preserve. They inscribe prohibitions, clear, narrow, declarative. On their surfaces, the verb forms do not invite, but curtail. Language interrupts space. There is to be no digging, no removal, no disturbance within named precincts, against named grounds. Sometimes a date locks the moment, the clay capturing calendrical specificity, situating silence in time. Sometimes a named signatory affirms the existence of a witness or a custodian. The lexical choices are deliberate, selected from bureaucratic vocabularies, suspended between what is possible and what is forbidden. The clay remembers these prohibitions, holding an inventory not of what has happened, but of what must not occur. The tablets become, in their very restraint, sentinels of absence. The record is not uniform. Some entries exist only as fragments, edges sheared, characters abraded, meanings deferred or uncertain. Transliteration notes, patient in their precision, gather the visible. The commentary lingers over minor variants in the choice of words, the peculiarities of paleography, the contextual field in which some restriction is named. The ink and clay offer no interpretive gloss, no parenthetical aside asserting supernatural risk, no margin calling down curse or fear. Only the vocabulary of injunction recurs, the administrative voice holding steady. What is forbidden is stated, then set aside, left to endure in the bureaucratic quiet. It is this lack of commentary, this composure of the record, that draws attention. The tablets, in refusing explanation, invite no certain reading of intent beyond restriction. They do not draw the boundaries of belief, only of place and conduct. The sanction is implicit, the consequence left unsaid or couched in the cool language of breach. In their restraint, these records do not grant access to motivation or context beyond what they stipulate. The silence of the scribe is as forceful as the words themselves. To read the tablets is to inhabit the interval between action and interdiction, to move along the thin line where law is present without exposition. Administrative corpora grow as an archive of traces. Each entry, however brief, accumulates authority. Over time, the negative record, the insistence of what is not permitted, emerges as its own form of presence, the law embodied in the ongoing threat of trespass. It is an archival tension, felt in every cross-reference, in every note on administrative practice. One is left to regard the precinct not as an open field, but as a locus defined by prohibition, a space circumscribed not by the visible marks of city or wall, but by the documentary silence that envelops it. The air thickens with regulation. The boundary registered not by stone or post, but by the continual reiteration of what may not occur. The tension lingers, attached to the ink, the clay, the indeterminate surface of bureaucratic attention. The past approaches in muted intervals. The ink dries, the clay hardens, but beneath the smooth surface other questions settle. The regulatory archive withdraws into itself, offering only the residue of denial. Silence thickens as the only commentary, the only certainty. In this space where nothing is explained, where no motive is given, law abides as absence, a spectral guard over the precinct. And so, returning again and again to the cool surfaces of the tablets, the index of existence composed in prohibition, one is left to turn over the final, unanswered remainder. For what was the digging forbidden? There is a quiet clarity to tradition. In the language of field surveys and the whispered logic of interpretive guides, small votive objects placed beneath thresholds or walls are presumed to confer ritual access, their presence mapping invisible lines of permission and protection. Through the veil of habit, it is understood. Such tokens are left to mark transition, their placement symbolic, their meanings invoked in the slow accretion of shared belief. In this framing, the act of placement is a simple gesture, wise in its repetition, closing the distance between people and the ground they claim. Resists the ease of this explanation. Year after year, layer after layer, the careful hands tasked with recovering the past brush away drifts of dust and accumulate another kind of pattern. Catalogues begin to fill with rows of identical beads, their surfaces dulled by time, their holes perfectly regular. There are notes abbreviating material: shell, stone, bone, clay. Their enumeration forms quiet columns, tallies of repetition, echoing through the lists. Each bead is traced to its origin within sealed pits, invisible from the surface, nestled deliberately beneath foundational timbers and the squared mass of stone blocks. The coordinates are precise, each point marked in relation to a vanished architecture, measured by string and grid, aligned to a geometry that now only survives in these records. The catalogue entries run on, tracing the quiet constancy with which these objects reappear, pit after pit, floor after floor, spanning sites separated by distance, yet joined by the symmetry of method. Pit dimensions are methodically given, their depth measured in centimeters, their edges described as sharply cut or blurred by collapse. Object counts stand unadorned, rarely exceeding intent, always circumscribed. Sometimes 2 or 3 beads, sometimes dozens. An inventory of proximity. There are notations for raw material, suggestive in their brevity, but never intimate. Perforated amulets, round, elliptical, opaque, sometimes glossed by mineral accretion, sometimes described as unremarkable, save for their orderly presence. Conservation notes are appended in the same hand. They speak in the passive voice of professional care, sealed matrix, undisturbed by intrusive tools. Nothing is removed before its placement is mapped. Nothing erased from the silent relationship between bead and pit, object and substructure. Across the expanse of territory and time, such placements recur, silent and systematic, resisting any claim to uniqueness. The repetition is unnerving in its steadiness. Each site, each foundation, conforms to a pattern less about display than disappearance. The beads are not left to be retrieved or seen, but to slip quietly beneath the threshold, sealed away from both view and touch. The observer is left looking down through the centuries at an arrangement that was never meant to be revisited, a sequence of actions fused into a mute foundation. The objects become part of an infrastructure, not of presence, but of purposeful absence, a logic of leaving, not showing. The closed pits are the only witness. The assumption of ritual access, the idea that these beads are signs for eyes or gestures for continued engagement, is troubled here. Instead, the fields of evidence suggest a practice not of cyclic presentation, but of permanent internment. Each bead, once placed, is shut away, lost deliberately to time and memory. In the tension between the evidence and traditional interpretation, a procedural depth emerges. These objects are not simply left, they are removed from circulation, entombed by intention. They occupy a threshold not between spaces, but between memory and forgetting, laid down in the hollowed ground and withdrawn from every future intention. The catalogues themselves, closed and aging, become artifacts of this silence. Their pages are brittle, margins repaired with care, the ink faded where hands have lingered. In the quiet rooms of archives, their entries seem to quiet further with each passing year, the authority of their tallies leaning into silence. From time to time, a researcher traces the lists, pausing over recurring object types, pit coordinates, the unobtrusive repetition of the same shapes, the same dimensions, the same sealed contexts. Questions surface and are left hovering. What was conveyed through this regular absence, this measured gesture of placing something forever out of reach? How, if at all, might meaning persist in silence when the gesture is permanent, not for the sake of recollection, but for the architecture of forgetting? You are left before these records, turning them gently, letting the path of evidence unfold at its own pace. The act was enacted, recorded, and sealed. The evidence remains, enduring, in its refusal to complete the circuit of meaning. All that is visible now is arrangement, a record of access denied, on purpose, over and over, in site after site. You inherit the model. The lines are familiar, their logic so smooth it becomes invisible. A city carries its dead at its very core, layer upon layer, as if life and death pulse together beneath stone and hearth. This is what you are told to expect, a slow sediment of human remains, pooled and mingled where the city thickens, where centrality marks presence and belonging. The prevailing schema draws no boundaries through the inhabited space. In this pattern, the boundary between domestic and funerary is porous, gently traversed by the movements of time and necessity. But here, with the record open before you, the evidence is not so yielding. There is no silent tide of interment pressing up below the city's heart. Instead, the registers unfold a different geometry, cool and resistant. The pattern does not waver. Human remains are found at the peripheries, never in the core. The clustering is precise, even disciplined, as though a hand refused to cross an invisible line. Each entry holds a name, or the absence of a name age articulated in increments, sex listed when it can be inferred. The old calculus of life and loss, alongside a careful accounting of grave goods, beads, blades, ceramics, diminutive tokens whose context is preserved in their fixed relationship to skeleton and soil. Beside these, every coordinate is given exact attention, northing, easting, depth below the datum. Most fields repeat, and it is in repetition that the refusal becomes palpable. The central squares, those grid-mapped hearts that should sing with intimacy and loss, return only emptiness. The absence recurs with such precision it becomes a kind of presence itself, amplified by its discipline. Maps textured by fieldwalkers' hands give the perimeter its density. Cemeteries gather along edges the furthest flares of habitation, skirting clustered dwellings, never breaching the red and black values that mark the sealed centre. The stratigraphic layers run deep here, stories pressed against each other, and yet the trowel finds no human bone, not a tooth, not even the faded, orderly hint of an earlier exhumation. Its integrity remains unmarred. So you hover, suspended in details. The inventory is exhaustive, the absence documented as rigorously as any presence. No intrusion beneath courtyards or public squares, no shadow of inhumation below the temples. The avenues, the merchants' avenues where daily life churned. There is no disturbance, neither by fire nor by pit, only the soft pressure of silence, held intact by the records. And outside, past each threshold, past the limits made by walls or ditches, the burials multiply and gather, graves marked in clusters, some rich, some spare, always at a measurable remove. The objects echo the flesh, never crossing inward, but circling, always at the margin. The archive does not flinch or embellish. It only counts, measures, accumulates what is real and what is not. Presence and vacancy become twin signatures. If you trace the system backwards, the question of plan intensifies. This is not the random outcome of centuries' disorder. The data is too clean, the partitions too carefully maintained. It is as though the city's center was closed to the dead from the beginning, even as lives unfolded just above. The absence here is not an omission. It is a deliberate refusal, repeated generation after generation, event after event, even as the world outside was allowed to change shape. You move slowly across each chart, each register. The evidence is cumulative, yes, and yet it resists synthesis. It does not consent to meaning, but instead returns you repeatedly to what cannot be spoken for. What principle kept the dead so far from where the living pressed most closely together? Not a single intrusion, not a single breach. The pattern is inscribed as absence, but this absence is not empty. You hear only the hush of unviolated soil, the neutral notations in the field book, the raw silence beneath the data's ordered array. So you mark absence, line after line. You dwell with the sensors of losses and withheld presences. Each coordinate, each entry, each empty square returns you not to certainty, but to renewed ambiguity. Missing bones, missing names, the precision of their omission, these become the substance of the evidence. Time accrues not in layers of flesh and bone, but in the immaculate, undisturbed ground. The city's heart seems to pause, held in the span between presence and omission. You circle back, again and again, to the measured, quiet rigor of the archive. You trace the edge, the moment of crossing that never came, careful not to imagine what is not there, careful to let the absence speak without translation. What principle kept human remains away from that inner ground? Uniformity is quietly demanded in the world of construction, an axiom both spoken and unspoken. It is assumed, as dawn assumes its light, that every foundation, every course, every pressed and sun-baked form will merge seamlessly with its neighbor, composed from the same clay, bound by the same straw, dried in the same watchful sun. The image persists. Structures built by repetition, a site unified not just in design, but in matter itself. This expectation drifts through records, through quiet observation, through the very plans left to us by time. It is a soft certainty, almost invisible, that walls, floors, and boundaries are tied together by sameness. Are the small interruptions, the thin slices of ancient earth gathered in silence, slid into glass, turned beneath the boreal light of the microscope. Uniformity does not survive their gaze. Mud brick, the most basic of manufactured things, dissolves under laboratory scrutiny into its constituent parts. The truth, always patient, waits inside these fragments. The laboratory reports betray the expectation. Composition is neither constant nor careless. There are patterns. Systematic, deliberate, silent, fine, tightly compacted bricks fill the central constructions, each granule settling into its neighbor, compacted, measured, carefully fused. Beyond, at the margins, the clay grows coarse, the inclusions larger, the straw thicker and less careful. Boundaries emerge, not only in the rise of walls, but inside the material's very being. In these moments, the record becomes tactile. Laboratories receive bags of earth, each labeled with location, depth, and a careful code. The process is slow, almost ritual. A sample enters the archive. It is recorded, weighed, shifted by spatula onto slides. Numbers are applied, laboratory IDs, sample depths etched in delicate graphite on glass. Under blade and polish, the brick reveals its secrets grain by grain, layer by layer, the past breaking open in thin section. The observer, quiet, notes the color, assesses texture, counts the number of inclusions, stones, straw, splinters, specks of minerals. All that was mixed by hands now floats in resin, held in stasis by time and technique. They describe granular, well-tempered matrices, the presence or absence of plant matter, the heterogeneity or uniformity of binder ratios. The slides neither conceal nor announce. They simply record. Polished mounts bear witness. Each inclusion is measured, tabulated, archived. Firing temperature estimates, too, are marked with caution here. The shadow of the kiln may have brushed the brick. There it cooled under the unyielding sun. Every datum offered without verdict. Every measurement suspended between evidence and silence. The data seem to draw boundaries sharper than the excavated walls themselves. Central spaces, those presumed places of gathering, or authority, or ritual, hold bricks whose fine matrix and consistent tempering speak to sustained technical investment. Their fabric is even, their inclusions minimal, their binders precisely calibrated. Beyond the core, the margins are defined by disparity, coarser particles, inconsistent organics, a rougher interplay of clay and additive. No editorial hand lingers in the notes, yet the difference accumulates, returning always to the uncertain space between center and edge. The substratum, heavy and layered, remains resolutely closed. Its own material logic is self-contained, unyielding to external eye or test. There is a tension here, quiet, but palpable, a suggestion, but never a declaration. That investment in skill and care was not evenly spent. Still, the evidence refrains from narrative. Thin sections return to their cases, slides slot into boxes lined with archival foam, petrographic descriptions filed under laboratory numbers with silent precision. The dust settles over tablets, reports, and stone. Material remains withdrawn from easy view, holding their answers in composite silences. The uniform surface of the past is ruptured only by careful observation, disturbance met with unexplained variety. How does one read such a pattern? The mind traces possibility, but returns always to the same restraint. No intention is named, no utility defined. The observer finds only what lies before the eye, a memory of care inscribed in matter, a riddle preserved in the remnants of technique. One might linger, fingertips resting on the cool surface of a brick, absorbing the imprint of lost labor, the echo of repeated gesture. No resolution emerges. The substratum, far below, persists in its opacity, a sealed layer beneath more deliberate craft. Nothing has breached it. Under the persistent hum of the laboratory lights, evidence continues its quiet resistance. The possibility that some purpose never named demanded superior technical effort for layers, hidden and protected, remains neither confirmed nor denied. It is left unresolved, a pattern inscribed in dust and stone, slipping away each time it is approached. The image endures, foundations, deep and unyielding, driven down to solidity. Engineers and builders, as if by unspoken consensus, summon the spectre of bedrock whenever permanence is invoked. Foundations are supposed to reach for something beyond doubt, something primitive, unshifting. The silence beneath all disruption. This, it seems, is the lesson carried forward. That every lasting structure descends, burrowing past habit and horizon, until stone meets stone in terminal certainty. That is how the story is told, how the diagram is drawn, how trust is conjured from the negotiation between intention and earth. The site reports persist in their quiet refusal to comply. Instead, they submit records, plaintext, unadorned, yielding no speculation, offering minimal ceremony. They describe, with all the austerity of the field, not a penetration but a layering, stone packing, courses of cobbles interspersed with shapes of grit, placed deliberately above what the report calls a compact horizon. The trench, not a descending socket, but a shallow basin, receives its burden not with promise of depth, but with a strange insistence on surface. There is the continuous clay lens, more membrane than threshold, lying beneath the stone, entire and unbroken. Field notes delineate it without commentary, measuring its length, charting its breadth. The substrate below remains untouched. Elevation sections are rendered with lines that do not trespass, their breaks chronicling discontinuity more than connection. Plan views, cross-sections, all aligned with a narrative that does not pursue the strata downward, but reviews the sequence above. Occupy the liminal space atop what the earth had already resolved. Every layer is described, not the violence of socket cut or bedrock breach, but the slow, granular increments on an unviolated plane. Investigators take depth measurements, a hand pressed against the clay, a tape running from surface to packed stone, an annotation marking the moment when gravel yields to substrate. The language of the report never attempts to explain, nor does it break formation to wonder. It consigns everything to record increment, thickness, or relationship, while allowing absence to pool in the details left unsaid. There is, always, a tension between the expected and the encountered. To find stone packing resting gently above the clay, to note the lack of incision, shifts the axis of understanding. Here, the earth is not cut open for stability. Rather, the foundation is granted in the upward layering, an architecture held aloft by what lies beneath. The clay lens is preserved, sealed, a surface kept intact, as the constructed world takes shape not through penetration but by respect, or perhaps by necessity, for the horizon's integrity. But the word respect does not appear. Only measurements, meticulously noted, as if in the conviction that enumeration alone might capture meaning. You see it first in the line work, a map drawn in absence as much as in presence. There is a silence in the gap between stone and original ground, a thin, unreal line that demarcates change without violence. The section views, side on, do not show downward movement. Instead, the foundation sits a weight, yes, but not a forceful one, its promise resting atop the sealed clay. Now then, always, the stone packing neither challenges nor disturbs, held above a silence it cannot breach. Sequence stands in for certainty. Reports track the approach, layer upon layer, arrangement after arrangement, but each description closes before the substratum is reached. No sockets are cut, no deepening trenches, no moment where intent and earth collide, only a pause at the threshold, as if the possibility of depth had been quietly declined. The observer is left to inhabit the residue of the field, the order of layers, the boundaries between material and void, the persistent refusal to explain. Nothing final is said. The absence of disturbance, its own kind of evidence, assumes gravity. And yet, in silence, something trembles. If normal expectation drives downward, insisting upon a confrontation with substratum, what then is a foundation that refuses to descend? The discontinuity insists on attention. Stone above, clay below, boundary unbroken. It is a structural hush, a mute uplift, a decision marked in the record only by the absence of what might have been cut away. Drawings commit only to what can be seen or measured. The minimal narrative becomes the space between entries, the breath between lines. There is a memory here, both in the residue of what is left undisturbed and in the careful neutrality of description. You may run your hand across the plan, linger on the unchanged clay. Note the circumscribed arena where change ceased. You are permitted only to observe, not to conclude. Again and again, the reports circle the horizon. Foundation, packing, clay lens, undisturbed earth. The silence, structural, deliberate, resists closure. Why build up from a sealed plane rather than cut down into the earth? It has long been the prevailing view. A burned layer beneath a floor is the residue of accident, the aftermath of conflagration and disruption, swiftly followed by renewal. Such layers, traditionally, have spoken quietly but resolutely of lost days and abrupt endings. Human moments marked by the force of flame, eventually overtaken by determination to begin again. The accepted logic moves cleanly, moving from devastation to restoration in a seamless arc. This narrative remains easy, its lines clear a cycle of accidental destruction, punctuating the steady march of construction, closure, rebirth. Yet as the sediment surrenders its secrets, the evidence does not fully align. There is a pause, a hesitation within the stratigraphy, where repetition unsettles the assumed order of events. Each log, meticulous, quiet, records layers, beneath floors, again and again, almost ritually. Burn traces recur. charcoal caught in small, distinct lenses. Patches of clay, the surface altered by heat, its texture changed, its colour deepened towards a burnt orange or dull grey. An uninterrupted black stratum, dense and uniform, pressed to fill the hollow beneath a later surface. Turned gently in the torch's beam, these accumulations are silent but not empty. Matrix thickness is measured precisely, the sweep of centimetres noted with care in column after column. No broken potrim, no spent bones, no tangled ash of domestic leavings. Only the burn material, contained, deliberate in its outlines, but unaccompanied by the clutter of daily living. Under these floors, once solid, now exposed to the air and the attention of present-day eyes, the story is quieter than the official version allows. Architects and excavators, those current witnesses, document with restraint. Context numbers, sampling coordinates, words formed in the short, neutral phrases of technical record. Each charcoal smudge is bagged and tagged, its precise origin within the thick, packed earth, mapped and fixed. Each lens is sliced thin, its structure preserved for laboratory light and later recall. The heat once present is long vanished. What remains is the memory of heat pressed into the very shape of the ground. Here, time and intention are difficult to disaggregate. Laboratory reports follow. These, too, are careful. AMS dates are returned. Numbers, ranges, tight intervals in the prehistoric span. Each date is linked, never floating, always referenced by its stratigraphic position, never outside the world of fill and floor and ceiling. The burned layer sits beneath, not within. It is not mingled with occupation debris. It is not scattered or breached. It is always sealed, always contained, always covered over by what will become the next surface, clean and unburned. Now and then, lab notes remark on the absence of inclusions. Nothing but the fire's own residue, glassy where clay fused, crumbly where charcoal survives. These observations accrue. Observers remark sometimes aloud, sometimes only in the chill of the workroom on the consistency. Across phases, through rebuilds, the pattern does not waver. The underlying burns are constant, persistent, neither chaotic nor spontaneous. The eye tracks these lines through the logbooks, each one a silent echo, gathering quietly beneath each constructed aftermath. Yet there are no signals of destruction in the spaces above. The living floors remain largely undisturbed, their surfaces surprisingly whole. Only beneath, at the edge of vision and memory, does the blackened matrix lie, waiting for recognition. The absence of domestic refuse is striking, nearly as loud as the burns themselves. The fill, thick or thin, is only and exactly what fire leaves behind, bordered cleanly, wholly isolated from intrusion. Containment is the refrain. Nothing enters, nothing leaves, until the next event of sealing comes to rest, rendering the heat inert. If there was violence, it is not left in the residue. If there was ritual witness, it is not documented. If there was meaning, it is now muffled in packed sediment, black as an old memory, dense as forgetting. The evidence holds the tension, unspeaking balanced between reading these layers as accidents or as acts more deliberate, more tightly bound to cycles of closure than to moments of loss. The apparent regularity is neither proved nor disputed. It simply accumulates, quietly contradicting the narrative of chaos and rekindling. Each line in the logs, each sample envelope, each depth measurement recorded, becomes a small echo, a fragment of what endures after fire has passed, and the ground is once again made level for habitation. The burned layers persist in their silence, settled and sealed, patient beneath fresh floors, long after the heat has gone. Their presence is an absence, the absence of explanation, of disruption, of carelessly discarded life. Only the burnt earth, held fast in the archaeological shadow, marks the point of division between what was and what will be, the memory of fire hidden in the seam, the dark line that resists erasure. Below the most ordinary floorboards, something remained unresolved and unclaimed by narrative or certainty. Why were these fires lit and then so carefully sealed beneath each foundation? There is, in the archive, A certain reassurance that all has been opened, the working idea that every level, every shaft, each chamber noted on the master plan has, at some point, been entered, seen, described, and left open to further examination. A continuity of access is imagined, an uninterrupted progression from surface to substrata, from the first exploratory trench to the deepest and darkest hollow below. It is the fiction that the site itself has yielded to method, that discipline and care have eroded all secrecy. This belief persists in the way sites are referenced, catalogued, written up in the calm afterglow of excavation seasons. The assumption passes quietly in inheritance, seldom spoken aloud, folded into the pages, resting between grid references and the shades of dust on field boots. Yet the evidence unsettles. Field notes, more tentative than certain, begin to register anomalies. Site crews, in the ordinary rhythm of trench extensions and cleaning profiles, regularly note later interruptions, cuttings that bite unexpectedly into older, undisturbed levels. These are not the grand, headline discoveries, but marginal observations. A section that does not align, a shaft that truncates an earlier deposit, notes in margins swiftly moving past the moment. Always, there is a trace, a suggestion of something altered, a rewrite not in words, but in the subtle geometry of earth and stone. These late cuttings always point backward, toward what is not seen, what is missing. But it is the absence itself, so carefully documented, that persists in the record. Central cavities, identified on early plans, repeat across seasons in the notebooks, the same words turning up again and again, intentionally inaccessible, not broken through, left sealed. There is always a specificity to these descriptions, a restraint recognizable even at a remove. Timber-lined shafts clearly marked, but the timbers themselves are hidden beneath a pale lake of concrete. Stone slabs are traced by the field hand, their thickness measured, mortar runs recorded at each edge, the damp contact with overlying layers carefully assessed, their surfaces witness to an earlier end, a moment chosen not to open, but instead to seal and preserve. Elsewhere, the pattern changes. At the margins of the site, photographic records show slabs in the process of removal, each one documented before being wrenched from place, a shutter click, preserving the moment just before intervention. These images are unremarkable at first glance. The ordinary act of excavation made visible, stone lifted, the dark hollow waiting beneath. But in the center, where the oldest chambers are mapped, there are only absence and repetition. The stone slabs remain untouched. Static across the photographic register, the sequence of images breaks, jumps ahead to later finds, or moves sideways to trenches where entry was permitted. The untouched slabs persist through seasons, spectral in their immobility. Documentation, in this context, becomes its own form of evidence. The notebooks display a methodical continuity, page after page of trench numbers, each slab rendered anew in field sketch and annotation, dimensions and depths listed with patient precision. The notes do not change across years. Always there is the same caution, an underlining of the risk that to remove these slabs, to break through the hard shell of concrete, would be to damage the integrity of overlying phases. The record is unwavering, concern for the vertical sequence, for the subtle transitions in earth, color and compaction, closes down the possibility of intervention. Field directors write in passive, neutral terms. Removal not recommended. Preservation of interface prioritized. The justifications accumulate, layer above layer, until what remains are the immaculate surfaces of the slabs themselves, undisturbed. What begins as a practical constraint, a response to structural instability, to timbers weakened by centuries of silence, hardens into a procedural axiom. Each unaccessed chamber becomes not a void but a document, the moment of refusal etched into the site's biography. The evidence is negative. Its power accumulates not in what is found, but what is withheld, what remains fossilized beneath the concrete and white mortar. Through this pattern, the archives grow silent. The site slows, becomes contemplative, haunted by a choice. The history is not one of discovery, but of a restraint so absolute that it, too, becomes a form of knowledge. In the dim, artificial light of the storage sheds, the slabs persist, gently swept clean at season's end, measured and remeasured. They occupy the imagined geography of closure. No record intrudes, no fingerprint in the underlying silt, no accidental breach by shovel or trowel, no hurried entry in the back of the field notebook. They remain a line between above and below, a silence in the archaeological record. These are the unread pages, the deliberately withheld chapters of the site's story. The air around them hums with a quiet tension, a decision deferred and preserved. Sometimes it is the absence, meticulously recorded, that resonates most, an echo of what might have been seen or found, if only the boundary had been crossed. Still, the stones rest beneath their measured light, untouched, alive with possibility. Who decided these chambers must remain unopened? You are told, again and again. That status announces itself upon the surface. That prestige, gravitas, authority, all the weight of rare material should make itself seen, broadcast its claim by light and height alike. It settles as a kind of architectural certainty, woven deep into the assumptions of inventory and monument. The rare shines, the imported astonishes, the public square receives what is finest, and the most precious elements always assert themselves above ground. Yet there is a ledger's hush beneath this noise, an otherwise silent stratum that accumulates exotic matter, not in the daylight, but under crawling layers of the central edifice. Here, the pattern becomes reticent. The entries file themselves away limestone from a far quarry, black basalt, glassy napped flint, each distinctly marked with provenances that echo overland journeys and distant outcrops, now silent, now packed in the dense darkness of foundations. The paperwork notes sample tags, each number a ghost of touch, a brief intimacy between recorder and stone, almost immediately relinquished to the permanent dusk below a public floor. Inventory sheets pause over the details. Fragment lengths and weights, colorations, and the elusive trace minerals betraying distance. Provenance analysis is careful, performed in the regulated light of the laboratory, recorded in tight columns: source locality, composition, context, depth. Placement notes, too, are measured. The particular stratum, its relationship to worn thresholds, the enveloping sediment, the absence of interruption. Below the surface structures, beneath those public geometries so often imagined as the primary theatre of meaning, these stones remain. Their allure is published only in reports, never in sunlight. Above, by contrast, the surfaces reserve almost none of it. No mirror of what runs underneath is found in the architecture visible to every passerby. If the imports boast any signature, it is in their absence from display. The weight of those shipments, so carefully delivered and distributed, lies quiet and spent beneath feet that will never notice it. Seen from the angle of the ledger, attention gathers, slow and unyielding. Why the concealment of value? Why the investment, so deeply, so irretrievably, into what is designed not to draw notice? The evidence is unhurried, splayed across records that close as evening descends upon the site. You enter, or you imagine entering, that space of documentation, unpacking a crate in faint, filtered light, a lingering smell of dust and past rains, the catalogue number etched on a tag, the gentle scrape of sample against trowel, the incremental weight readout. All this is bracketed by the knowledge that here, beneath the grand elevation, the rare stones make up foundations. They disappear into the structure's silence, layered by intent, or perhaps by habit, aggregator of memory and resource alike. Instead, what is extraordinary is what is concealed, concretized into a layer not meant for eyes to find, except in the act of dismantling or inquiry. Even the reports themselves, upon closing, offer only a faint kind of memorial. A numbering, a packing, a careful annotation before the crate lowers into storage's dusk. Description replaces display. Weight, sample, provenience, the occasional microscopic analysis, all filed away with the indifferent efficiency of those who know not to expect answers. Memory, here, clings to the margins. The imported stone beneath the city's centre, silent, unmoved, unacknowledged, gathers the passing of time as a sediment might accumulate silt. The distinction between what is seen and what is recorded sharpens, and with it comes another layer of loss. What once glittered in movement and selection now serves, mute and supportive, its origins archived in handwriting and carbon copy, its physical presence folded under the edifice. The careful movement of material chosen, weighed, reweighed across valleys, perhaps through hands and silence, only to be lost to view more completely than if it had never been moved at all. Documentation remains, fragmented, always one step removed from the presence it purports to inventory. The crate, sealed and moved to storage, is merely the latest veil dropped across the imported stone's circuitous journey. The silence persists, mapped in depth and plotted by grid coordinates. In each record, the suggestion hovers allocation as statement, but not performance. Is the true marker of value not always visibility, but maybe the very opposite? To be locked away, trusted to support what outlasts immediate attention, settled into a layer meant never to be disturbed? All else is darkness, subdivision, and the patient sleep of things withheld. What warranted placing non-local stone out of sight and under layers meant never to be disturbed. The architecture of authority, it is often said, is marked by its permeability, the steady pulse of consultation, retrieval, and action. Central archives embody this belief. They present themselves as the open heart of administrative order, repositories alive to touch and time, records flowing outward into the rhythm of daily control. You have stood at their thresholds, watched the careful passage of tablets from niche to hand, the murmurs of record keepers tracing old decisions. Here, so the story goes, governance is a matter of constant access, and the archive is always awake to its purpose. That is the surface of things. Beneath this surface, quieter rooms remain undisturbed. Not all tablets are equally at hand, not all archives answer summons. Across epigraphic registers, sealed inventories linger in notation lists that do not invite the reaching hand, rooms catalogued but never entered in living memory. The records make mention. Sealed rooms, deep lying beneath the central complexes, sealed tablets stored in sealed rooms. The language repeats as you read, ceiling upon ceiling, door nested within door. The clay envelopes remain intact, bearing no scar or fracture, no sign of ever having been broken. Their surfaces, instead, retain the trace of another instrument. Conservation notes mark them as intact, no post-depositional opening recorded, no evidence of disturbance. Archival light is measured now, slow and oblique, filtering past ancient closures. Cataloguing proceeds with the precision of ritual. Photographic plates capture the tablets as they now appear, their surfaces clean and legible beneath the glass, inscriptions untroubled by the hand of reading. Context sheets array their details in columns. GPS coordinates, silent in their accuracy, layer descriptions receding down through stone into shadow. Humidity is noted. The sealed boxes are counted. Routine preservation, preserved in the log. Each detail accumulates, muffled, careful not to cross the barrier between observation and intervention. You imagine the act of sealing as it once occurred. The envelope wrapped, the impression pressed, soft clay suddenly formalized and set. Every seal tells of a moment with held administrative intent paused in the clay, a message prepared and then suspended beneath earth and stone. These are not letters in transit. They are conclusions locked away before the messenger could be summoned. The rooms themselves, cold and airless for centuries, offer nothing of the noise of consultation. Their catalogue numbers rest quietly beside conservation notes written in a hand now fading. Still, the records say, the tablets are legible. They are fully inscribed, capable of speech if one were to break the closure. Yet the clay remains unbroken, the text withheld. They await a reader who does not arrive, a reading that does not occur. You are shown photographs, surface readings, but never the contents themselves. The field reports articulate what is visible: clay husks, perfect seals, the suggestion of message within. The interior remains unaccessed, and no record is kept of any attempt. The central archive, then, is revealed as a layered phenomenon. Above, the tablets move and are handled. Below, something quieter settles sealed records, whose silence is not accidental, whose withholding is preserved in administrative choreography. These seals do not merely close, they declare an active refusal of access, an intention perpetuated in the very protocol of record-keeping. The sealed tablets rest much the way unread letters do a possibility, a question, their answer suspended indefinitely. Here, the archive is divided against itself. Open record and closed message. The tension persists in every context sheet, every conservation note, every measured photograph. Night deepens in the lower rooms, unbroken by the light and regularity of retrieval. The sealed tablets turn away from the gaze of administration, their clay refusing the flicker of interpretation. The evidence is whole and silent, the impression of the seal more vivid than any name or date. You return, repeatedly, to the registers, each notation reiterating the same outcome: intact envelopes, sealing impressions catalogued with care, no breach recorded, no context of reading. What is held back is not simply data, but the very potential of archival speech, preserved but unrevealed. What lingers is not an absence of records, but a record of enforced absence. Tablets that could be read, should someone choose, but whose silence is curated as deliberately as any inscription. The archive's operation is incomplete in a way that radiates uncertainty, a boundary as formal as any law or edict. You sense the archival breath slowing in these depths, every act of record crossed by the memory of what is not read, what is not known. Conservation lingers over the surface, never breaking through. The imprints of decision are visible, but their content cannot emerge. You walk through the layers, stone over stone, deeper into what is withheld. What records were intentionally sealed away from future readers? It begins, as it always does, with expectation. The earth is opened, and a silent agreement precedes each descent, that the layers will unfurl in the gentle logic of daily custom, the strata accumulating in the predictable order of life's repetition. Digging down, one expects to encounter the familiar patina of usage floors, worn thin by movement, surfaces repeatedly traversed and inevitably surrendered to the persistence of habit. Organic matter, in the script of archaeological convention, is presumed transitory. It is supposed to dissolve, to disappear, or, when remaining, to bear the unmistakable evidence of having been lived upon, witness to the cycles of occupation, abandonment, return. Yet, here the sequence hesitates. Beneath exposed floors, embedded and preserved, are the impressions of reed mats, broad, flattened traces pressed into ancient ground. There is no evidence of wear. They reside not as relics smoothed by passage, but as markings sealed quickly beneath new construction, as though each mat, once in place, became the closing gesture rather than the backdrop to continual activity. Each stratum records intentionality, an act of covering and containment, a sanctifying gesture, final and unyielding. The documentation is unhurried, methodical. Field records enumerate what is seen. Oblong ghosts etched into the substrate where reeds once lay. The surface descriptions linger on minute gradations, angles and junctions, fibers interlocked with silt, delicate striations running the length of a vanished border. Sometimes, in pockets denied to air, the reeds themselves persist. Their colour is altered, their substance changed by waterless years, yet still, in the dim light of the conservation lab, one can follow the parallel ridges, the incremental rhythm of weaving. Species are identified, a catalogue of fibres measured, listed, placed within depth coordinates. The record keeps its own counsel. Every mat is charted, not as a layer worn by occupation, but as a thing placed, then entombed, its presence fleeting yet unexpectedly permanent. Impressions locked below a hardening clay or limestone surface, patterns flattened so utterly that only pressure and patience can show where a reed bundle once rested. The eye learns to trust the negative. Depressions where the world pressed softly, then was denied further entry. Floor is built upon floor, line atop line, mats sealed within silence, shielded from further purpose. There are no footprints lingering above the reedwork, no polish at the edges to suggest repeated passage. It is not the incremental erosion of life pressing down over years, but something sharper and less knowable, a sudden burial, a final laying down, an absence preserved by the act of making absent. The cycle is familiar and strange, organic surfaces overlaid, never walked upon, closed in darkness, never rising to the state of patina. Each entombment offers an uncanny finality. There is no gradual transition from presence to disappearance, only the abruptness of closure. In the laboratory, gloved hands trace every strand, each twist of the fibre. Weave patterns are mapped not for their beauty or irregularity, but for the very fact of their preservation, their improbable endurance. The records remain silent on the quality of craft, speaking only to the intersection of material and event. Where oxygen failed to penetrate, bundles survive. Those that did not, remembered only by their shallow print, hold less, and yet somehow more, the idea of a mat, a thing both present and impossible. In the stratigraphic archive, repetition slowly undoes certainty. Sequence after sequence reveals the same logic, a reed mat, carefully arranged, deliberately overlaid, then immediately sealed. The familiar assurance of continuous habitation wanes. Instead, the layers whisper of interruption, of surfaces prepared but uninhabited, of gestures traced only once, then hidden beneath more lasting stone. Each closure is an argument against the presumed flow of occupation, a shadow at the threshold of the known. Over time, these organic residues accumulate, not as the memory of presence, but as the memory of something denied completion, an intended potential rendered motionless. How does one account for this persistence, this refusal to be erased, the fragile, the perishable, rendered permanent by absence of use, the violence, or gentleness, of sealing what should have disintegrated in time's regular course? In the quiet after excavation, when the air is cool and the dust settles back over the open ground, these impressions remain, flattened in the record. They lie as the softest echo. Hands once arranging, footsteps silent before the closing surface. Close your eyes, and it is possible, for a moment, to imagine the gentle resistance of reed pressed into earth, the weight of soil carefully tamped above it, the impossibility of reversal. There is no sound. Now, only the question lingering in the strata, unyielding despite each attempt to decipher the sequence, resistant to direct explanation. The evidence persists, neither erasing nor revealing, silent in its entombment. What was the purpose of preserving these perishable surfaces beneath lasting stone? An ordinary expectation governs the field, echoing through soil and report. The bones of animals, when revealed beneath the sweep of the archaeologist's trowel, are remnants, only the aftermath of meals, the unfinished work of consumption and discard. Faunal remains, it is claimed, are detritus. They settle into the middens at the margins, blending with the refuse of other days, other hungers. Inhabitants eat, slice, clean, abandon time and earth perform their work. This is the anticipated rhythm. The record of domestic life accrues as discard, and the domestic scatter expands with the passage of years. Such is the baseline expectation through which we peer into the darkness beneath our feet. Yet, as the careful eye turns from the edges to the center, the certainties flicker. In the hushed precincts of foundational thresholds and central plinths, something interrupts the schema. The remains here do not dissolve into the noise of rubbish. Instead, what is unearthed is an orderliness that resists easy explanation. Heads, not fragments, but entire rest in deliberate alignment, jaws sealed in quiet juxtaposition, as if purpose had pressed them down into the depth, then closed earth over the silence that followed. Articulated limbs trace anatomies undisturbed by butchery, their bones connected in calm defiance of scattering hands. Liminal spaces between foundation and floor conceal an array of choices, spelled out in animal form. These bones have not simply fallen through cracks, they have been gathered, placed, and entombed, each a record of decision enacted and then concealed. Lab sheets unfold quietly, columns marked with element counts, annotations in tidy hands. There, the state of articulation is noted with the restraint of observation. Bones, in connection, not randomized or disarticulated. The clean absence of cut marks, those usual signatures of consumption, persists as a silence in the record, a negation, a void where violence might have spoken. Each limb, each skull, is measured, checked, described in prose that denies embellishment, that aligns itself with the neutrality of the archive. The evidence accumulates not as story but as data. Sealed contexts, boundaries of excavation, locations transcribed beneath thresholds and behind stones. There is no diffusion here, no careless tossing into the shadows at the periphery. Instead, animal remains find themselves caught within encapsulated moments, marked off from the flow of daily disposal. These central lists diverge further from the patterns familiar at the margins, where refuse piles speak in fragments, disjointed and incomplete. These assemblages manifest singularity and care. Species appear by selection, not by accident. The array does not echo the broad spectrum of kitchen discard. Inventory comes to a close with the labeling of paper bags. Each specimen boxed and registered, the enclosure repeated in miniature as remains are moved beneath thresholds into perpetual containment. There is a measured repetition to this process, an echo of ancient handling in the contemporary motion of cataloguers. The sequence is unhurried, lifting, recording, enclosing, archiving. Every gesture is mirrored in the evidence itself, sealed, marked, stilled. A whisper of unease passes through the act of documenting. The distinction is not loud, but it persists. It is the separation between waste and intent, between what is simply left behind and what is arranged to last. The membranes of time and sediment are their last companions. This is not the scatter of bones lost to cycles of discarding. It is the memory of hands that chose differently, even as the reasons recede beyond the reach of the ledger. Context is a kind of silence. From the edge of the foundation, where discarded bones blend into anonymity, to the heart of construction, where each piece is selected and placed here, the absence of culinary mark is a presence in its own right. The border between garbage and commemoration is not voiced, only implied through form, placement, and the closing of space. What one set of bones lacks in violence, it lacks in noise. In their quiet interruption of expectation, they suggest an alternative, but only through their continued refusal to settle into the category assigned. Within the archive's subdued light, specimen bags are annotated, boxes are shelved, and the evidence endures in orderly seclusion. Each enclosed limb or skull is a recursion of the initial act, to label, to contain, to remove from circulation. Layers of time settle, sediment and bureaucracy working in tandem. Memory softens at the edges as context hardens. In each box, the weight of decision is matched by the weight of forgetting. The remains rest where they are not seen, but accounted for, assigned a number, and shelved against some future attention. Their story is shaped not by what is known, but by what is withheld by the quiet distances maintained between selection and abandonment, between recognition and closure. Across the surface of stone and soil, the evidence lingers. It is not only the positive trace, the whole head, the articulated limb that unsettles. It is, also, the absences, the places where cut marks could be, but are not, the categories that cannot quite contain what has been assembled. These central placements, quietly curated, endure as a minor yet persistent dissonance beneath the broader expectation. They are sealed, boxed, counted, never explained. In the final instance, we are left not with solution, but with a single, insistent uncertainty. Which practices decided that certain animal remains should be placed and then permanently sealed beneath key thresholds? It has long been presumed, almost without question, that any cavities traced below ancient grounds, any voids surfacing in the earth beneath these sacred centers, must be scars left by later hands. The field assumption settles in quietly, unchallenged. Such spaces result not from intention or design, but from disturbance, the restless, searching labor of those who arrived after. The routine, familiar narrative traces each hollow back to the soil pick, the hurried dig, the deliberate removal by unseen looters in some unrecorded, ambiguous night. Engineers, approaching their work in measured lines, learn to expect only this: that the ground beneath would correspond to what could be seen above, homogeneous and inert, yielding only beneath the pressure of present inquiry or prior incursion. Recording after recording threads its way through the survey logbooks, interfering with the settled clarity of this belief. There are other absences, of a different kind, ones that appear not as chaotic or random, but as patterns, echoes, movements of sound and silence. When the engineers moved among the scattered stones and resting dust of the old centres, they brought with them not shovels or blades, but ears and hands, instruments of listening, the simple percussion surveys, the modest-sounding tests. Each delivered its own impression upon the ground, a brief pulse, a gentle knock, the sort of careful touch intended only to register a reaction, not to intrude. The field notes accumulate quietly, each entry etched in the same measured script. At this gridline, 3 steady taps, then the pause, and after, the prism of response, a hollow note, an unbidden echo. The logs require and receive details: strike pattern, position, time of day, orientation of the tool, the sound's decay. Depth is always inferred, never certain, the calculation a matter of resonance, timbre, response length. Each datum is hedged with uncertainty, a measured absence rendered visible through the language of sound. The references map themselves out in neat, unwavering grids, suggesting order, logic, intentionality beneath the surface. The ground, once assumed solid and continuous, is redrawn in these records as interrupted, divided, host to regular voids whose precise form resists vision but yields, briefly, to the evidence of echo. Test after test, field after field, the records grow fuller, but the hands never follow the sound into the earth. There are no marks of trenches cut in the aftermath, no scars dragging knowledge downward into matter. Those echoing hollows, described in clean technical prose, remain undisturbed. The logs note their geometry as regular, consistent widths, echoes dying off at predictable intervals. There are no wild, torn margins, no signs of collapse or infiltration found in the percussion return. Instead, the contours speak of deliberation, of cavities traced and closed rather than shattered open. Still, the teams leave them alone. The measured reports collect on tattered forms, folded into archive boxes or imaged onto blue volumes, their content both persistent and reticent. Silence hovers around these sites, not merely in the absence of voices, but in the careful refusal to pursue evidence with invasive certainty. The ground is heard, but not opened. In this, the discipline of the survey becomes a record of discipline itself. Absence identified, acknowledged, yet never entered. The engineers become custodians of the unknown, tasked not with revelation, but with witnessing the fact of a measurable void. It is an emptiness documented and left untouched, allowed to persist as a feature of the landscape, as present as any mound or plinth, and yet forever inaccessible. Tension gathers in the unresolved space between what is registered and what is enacted. Instruments do not lie, but they also do not penetrate. The distinction between what can be inferred and what can be claimed becomes fundamental. The hollow answer from below, captured in the moment, persists only as long as the record is read or remembered. The field notebooks relay these fading signals, each response mapped on a page, then left to drift into quiet. There are archival echoes too, in the act of remembrance. Each time the evidence is revisited, the memory of the process, the rhythm of the strike, the hush between notes, the way the hollow grew stronger or died away, unfolds anew. Lines of sight are retraced in the mind. The surface crossed again with the lightest touch. Nothing disturbed, all patterns given their due space. The intention not to violate, to leave the inferred cavity unbreached, becomes as significant as the discovery itself. The evidence exists as a held breath, a space marked and cherished because it is not filled or claimed. And so, the field logs thicken with silent confirmations the presence of deliberate emptiness, regularly shaped, deliberately maintained, and yet left inviolate. The assumption of homogeneity crumbles quietly under the accumulation of these records. Still, nothing is resolved. The ground resists the hand as the evidence resists the claim to certainty. Only the memory of echo, the record of absence, persists. What was the function of those cavities that teams were content to register and then leave alone? The expectation lies upon these small objects. Seals are marked as instruments of administration, agents of order. Neat signatures compressed into clay. Closure granted through impression. The archaeological record repeats this protocol. Sealings catalogued, their presence ticked off in registers of document storage, their function interpreted as a final stage in bureaucratic routine. Closure, authentication, permission. The story appears straightforward, quietly ordered. Yet, among layers of dust and stone, the repetition grows unsteady. The register expands. A column for each fragment of clay worked between the fingers, stamped, pressed into place. Not just once or twice, but again and again, sealings turn up where mere paperwork would not suffice. These are not bound to tablets alone. Instead, clay lumps, still bearing the negative trace of intaglio cylinders, are wedded to walls, thresholds, pockets in mortar. The architectural record mutely details abundance not at desks or archives, but at places made to bar, fill, shut. Access points are methodically blocked and thickened. Fresh clay closes off voids, innervated by the faintly repeating roll of geometric and figural motifs, pressed by unseen hands and then covered. Their materiality, once active, now fixed in the chill of buried silence. Each motif receives its line. Possible lions, abstract forms, a cuneiform edge, one flattened corner from being embedded in a still soft surface. The wear patterns are noted in cool margin, fingerprints erased by time, impressions casting only partial figures. Associated contexts are referenced room numbers, phase codes, approximations of elevation. No extrapolation ventures to cross the threshold between the explicit and the secreted. The data holds steady. Sealed closures, sealed voids, sealed points of former passage. All recorded in the language of observation, not declaration. Shelved behind glass or preserved in drawer-lined repositories, the imprints endure a library of negative space and vanished intention. Photoplates, cool and unlabeled at first glance, hold these forms in monochrome. Light slants and shadows fall, tracing the rounded, often fragmented geometry of once malleted closures. The clay bears not history but the cessation of movement, blocked apertures, protected emptiness. Tactile memory resides in these objects, poised between what is shown and what is suppressed. No voice intrudes from the past, no inscription claims authorship for the sealed division. Only the material remains dense, mute, at the intersection of act and obscurity. Repeated returns to excavation logs offer no more closure than the sealings themselves. The notation is almost ritual, a cyclical recitation, location, context, diameter, motif. One lump, scored by the roll of a cylinder seal, is pressed into a crack adjoining the floor. Another, less legible, seems haphazardly wedged within a blocked corridor. Motif half-masked by mortar. Multiple closure sealings accumulate at certain axes, layers of shutting. The observer records but withholds commentary. How many hands pressed these seals? How many times was the act repeated? The same circle of touch and pressure, of obstruction. The question is not written, only circled silently, suggestion ringing in the unsaid. There is a tension, palpable but rarely confessed, between marking and masking. Sealing, in its very material act, is both a sign and a barrier, a residue, both administrative and embodied, both symbol and physical stop. A door, once open, now sealed in clay. A passage, now obsolete in material. Out of habit, the narrative tries to return to explanation, but evidence resists. The objects withdraw into their context, still bearing silent witness to the ambiguity of their own making. Each impression recalls a process, clay-shaped and pressed, a cylinder rolled, a surface masked, a gap halted. But the hands recede, and the rationale with them. Over time, the entries accumulate, the technique repeated and overwritten, yet the logic never fully revealed. The dust does not settle in a single day. The catalogue is revised and expanded across seasons, each return to the evidence finding the same unresolved loop between closure and signification. To photograph a ceiling is to summon its shadows, its small drama of surface and depth, never the full action or meaning it once bore. The clay, though hardened, gathers dust, accrues silence. Its impression waits, suspended at the edge of what has been, on a threshold never wholly crossed. Time moves onward, context drifts. Mortar crumbles, walls press inward. Hands that once sealed, touched, pressed the clay into the gap, have long vanished. Only the voids blocked, the transitions halted, the surfaces impressed remain never fully opened, never fully explained, always present at the closure of space and certainty. What hand sealed these thresholds shut with nothing but clay? It is so often assumed a quiet conviction braided through the handbooks and the old municipal notes. Urban streets, over decades and centuries, are constant witnesses to accumulation. Movement leaves its traces. Pedestrians, workers, carts and their iron wheels, the slow layering of habits, all presumed to gather together in a kind of democratic sediment, one footstep atop the last, one cart rut presiding over the subtle, half-obliterated shadow of another. The familiar drawing, a simple section through any street, layers sketched as if they simply arrived, flattened by ordinary traffic, joined by a continuity of intention. What has come before remains, veiled but present, quietly underlying the latest sweep of stone or the most recent pattern stamped in dust. The expectation is almost comforting in its inevitability. Yet, paper records admit a more complex geometry. Folded section drawings, never quite lying flat, offer a structure less consistent, stubbornly rearranged. The outer streets, those running along the edges where activity disperses, reveal resurfacing upon resurfacing, courses and patches overlaying each other in measured thicknesses, as if daily use gave the city's edge an ever-thickening armour. But the processional ways that plunge toward the city's core falter abruptly. Their mapped courses stop, not gently fading, but in sudden, compacted cordons. At the threshold where one expects only continuity, there is instead a firm and silent abutment, a line pressed tightly against the sealed stone of the innermost precinct. There are no lines to show further entry, no faint scarring where passage might have fought to persist through forbidden ground. The plan becomes a study in stasis, a boundary marked not in flourish but in refusal. Turning the archive's plans in hand, you see records that are both sparse and overloaded. They list paving courses by type and age, measured thickness, unexpected, in streets so worn. Each course traced, its dimensions noted, acute distinctions made between the battered shells at the city's edge and the untouched thresholds. The surveyor's hand, steady and unhurried, marks details in ink. The number of cobbles counted between shallow surface repairs, the position and depth of rut marks where carriage wheels strained through seasonal cycles of use, the abrupt surface changes that signal not gradual neglect, but a decision, a termination. The plan edges praise the messy persistence of repair, evidence of adaptation. The centres, by contrast, resist entry, terminating with meticulous, unyielding lines. A cross-section glimpsed in dusty light, the outer street rebuilt upon itself, telling its age by the number of gravel seams, the repeated laying of rough-set cobble and sand replaced, compressed, restored. The ruts score these outer lanes in long, measured strokes, shallow here, deep there, passing in and out of repair. Evidence clings in the margins. Patched sections, stones of differing hue, mortar that runs paler or richer as periods of renewal mark themselves against forgetting. But always, as the plan draws closer to the heart, the repairs fall away. No marks, no seams, only the hard, resilient closure of stone meeting stone. The threshold is not smoothed over, but rendered acute an edge, where traffic is made to pause, to gather, and perhaps turn aside. What is recorded is as telling as what is left unnoted. The surveyor's notes surrender little beyond these measurements. Methodical lines, tabulations without commentary. Here cobbles number 22 across a span. Their ruts reach a depth not seen again toward the core. Rut marks end, where the compacted barrier of the cordon appears never crossing. The processional route, rather than passing through, finds its progress arrested. Once, then again, and again. The plan records the same deflection, the same termination. Nowhere do surface scars suggest that these barriers were later breached or quietly circumvented. The silence of passage is as evident as the presence of wear. No lingering disturbance, only a meticulous refusal. In this layering of evidence, the core assumption of uninterrupted movement, of the city as a single, flowing tissue, is quietly unsettled. What arrives is a pattern of deliberate deflection, constrained movement. Repairs accumulate along the outer bands, witnesses to friction and adaptation. The city's periphery thickening against time. At the center, thresholds tighten, paving ends with silent finality, and the precinct beyond is sealed without visible sign of passage. The city arranges itself, evidences suggest, not as an open artery, but as a labyrinth, subtle in its rerouting, its absences signifying as strongly as its stone. The inked plans tell little of intent. They do not yield motive, only record the thickness of stone, the abruptness of a border. Each drawing folds into silence, the lines arrayed with the mute patience of artifacts waiting for a voice. To touch the records is to move in the company of boundaries. Measured, repeated, unwavering. The tension lingers at every turned page, every silent threshold captured and preserved. Streets terminate. Repair persists only until a certain locus is reached, then the fabric folds inward, withholding. The absence of certain evidence, the stubborn silence at the city's heart, resists easy resolution. Survey becomes meditation, mapping interruptions more than continuities. The ink lines pause, and in the hush that follows, nothing is explained. Patterns emerge, recede, and settle again into ambiguity. The sense of loss is not the loss of material, but of passage, of the imagined continuity halted at the threshold. Structures wrestle quietly with the expectations of movement, possibility gathered and then quietly quelled. Why were thoroughfares ended rather than extended into the innermost precinct? We are taught, almost by habit, that names given to places are markers designed to shift and settle with the landscapes they describe. The prevailing certainty undisturbed, almost invisible, is that toponyms drift like dust across the ages, settling at last into memory, little more than linguistic residue of what was once function, ritual, or simple occupation. This belief forms a gentle background noise, rarely questioned, rarely attended to. It holds that, in the end, names are only echoes, no longer instructions, only artifacts. But the shelf is never quite silent, and sometimes the dust holds more than memory. In the repetitive patience of archival work, these assumptions are unsettled, not by loud contradiction, but by the quiet persistence of the sources themselves. The evidence does not declare. It accumulates quietly in glosses and notations. Lexical lists, painstaking, dry, almost clinical bear within their ordered rows. The annotation not to be dug or forbidden. The lists do not elaborate. They do not venture an explanation. They attach a warning to a place name, simple as a shadow cast across stone. Later chronicles, removed from the origins of both mound and name, mirror this formula. They inscribe, mechanically, names paired with brief glosses. A town, a hill, a silent rise of earth, labelled only for an action denied, forbidden to dig, sacred, set apart. No narrative emerges, only the repetition of proscription. The hand that recorded did not explain. The record did not justify. Attestation alone, this place, this name, this rule. No further commentary. The silence is almost palpable. Absence takes on its own gravity, shaping the material left behind more sharply than any abundance might have. The ink is thin, the meaning dense. Philological notes, marginal and almost apologetic, accumulate across centuries. They record variants, slight shifts of spelling, the soft erosion of vowels, the subtle encroachment of new formulae. The recurrence of the taboo marking persists. Not to be opened, one variation whispers, another mutters, forbidden to till. Each entry is tightly bound to its own context. And yet, across lists and times, the formulaic nature is undeniable. There is no flourish, no hypothesis. The language is rigorous, clean, withholding, attested, not interpreted. By their own reticence, these records challenge what has seemed most stable about the march of names. The received wisdom claims that later names merely mark what a place once was. A burial ground, perhaps, or a site of ancient rite, long since untended, its function lost to the deepening shade of time. But here, in these entries, the language is not engaged in memorialization. It is instead carrying a rule forward, unmoored from the actual labor or danger or sanctity that once enforced such restraint. The prohibition persists in word, even after it has vanished in custom. A lexical fossil, the word as ban, long after the hand forgot to heed it. The tension is quiet but insistent. Where we expect language to mark only what is gone, we find it enforcing a silence, preserving a negative space in the very vocabulary of the place. To be named, in some cases, is to forbid, to declare, obliquely, that a boundary remains even after the marker itself has faded. The record shelf does not elaborate. The evidence accumulates, dust thickening on the unopened spine. The forbidden mound reduced to a line of text. Time stretches then, now, and the spaces in between pressed into the smallness of a gloss or the barely muttered note of a scribe. No voice offers interpretation. There is no hermeneutic flourish, no thread of story to lead away from the evidence itself. Names, contexts, attestations. The mound remains in script alone, its prohibition now an archival habit. What is it to encounter a name whose function is restriction, in a text purely documentary? What residue remains in a name that commands restraint, centuries after the hand that wrote it last obeyed? In the silence, the ink defines a negative, an action not taken, a ground not touched. The rule survives the rulemaker. The place name, now, is a record less of use than of abstention. The evidence stands. Nothing more than a mound, a name, a line on a list, a prohibition that endures with no context to enforce it, as if the act of writing the name is itself the preservation of the boundary. Among ruins, in the faded dusk of scholarship, the name alone survives a faint insistence on what must not be done, even as reasons and warnings have calcified into opacity. It is absence that endures. The texts fall quiet on their shelf, ink darkening in the long night, and still the trace remains. A boundary written, unbreached, understood only by what is left unsaid. What history is encoded in a name that tells you not to touch the ground? The city, in its silent dissolution, promises continuity. Streets and thresholds vanish and rise beneath one another, each era treading over the last, erasing detail with the slow certainty of footsteps. The accepted truth is written into layers, that the ground, under the unbroken press of feet and intent, compacts itself in narrow bands, the mark of continuous movement rendered as sedimentary fact. Across an imagined plane, every citizen, every visitor, every unspoken purpose collectively inscribes the surface with gradual, ceaseless pressure. This is the rhythm of occupation, the ever-renewed compaction of earth, eons accumulating in a soft, relentless rhythm. Consequential wear becomes the city's pulse, muted, patient, indisputable. This is how the story is usually told. It is not a matter of absence, but of something more precise, more incongruous, something that resists the easy narrative of continuous trampling and slow attrition. In the lab's stillness, under the washed fluorescence of lamps, the micromorphology reports lay open, pages quiet and heavy with notation. The slides, slide after slide, reveal not superimposed layers, thickened by time, but a singular, stubborn horizon. A plane, pressed and compacted to an unusual degree, running faultlessly beneath central rooms. Not a scatter of intermittent pressure, not the randomness of footfall across centuries, but a deliberate, resolute compression. Describe each particle's fit, the orientation of silt and sand's angular bodies. Fine grains curl, close packed, each recumbent toward an imposed order, scarcely achieved by chance. A compression index, deviating from the pattern, expected in a place surrendered to perpetual traffic, measuring not the fickle intensity of daily life, but something more decided. Overlying this dense horizon, placed as if by unseen precision, sedimentary fills appear cleaner, lighter, calculated, a silence upon the pressure beneath. Every micromorph sample is both a map and a memorial, meticulously catalogued, labelled, sealed, carried from the shadowed remains into the clinical hush of drawers and boxes. In the memory of soil, there is a kind of silence, a compaction not into oblivion, but into clarity. There is little scatter of trampled dust, little ambiguity, little muddle of overlap, just that horizon, decided in its density and uniformity, running without obvious disruption, a surface that seems to have been fixed rather than worn down organically. Above it, fills rest, layered with conscious intent, as if to protect or enshrine, rather than to continue the daily churn. The city's central rooms, more guarded than most, more resistant to time's routine abrasions, speak in negation, their most telling history compressed in a single, unwavering band, withdrawn from the expected rhythm of use and wear. Fingertips slowing across the textural indices, the angular notations accumulated in slow, careful script. The sequence is consistent. Beneath the floor, a horizon of nearly unnatural compaction, after which the chaos and scatter return, but only in the fills. A before and after, clear and almost ceremonial, the silence of use followed by the silence of withdrawal. The observers, unknown now, witnessed in their records only, become echoes through these voracious absences. They did not describe prolonged occupation. They marked, instead, a singular episode of stabilization, enduring enough to resist the scouring passage of time, deliberate enough to resist erasure by the next wave of footsteps. The evidence persists where most traces are lost, not in the crumbling wall, nor in detritus scattered by wind and hand, but in the firm, near motionless plain preserved, almost venerated, in the darkness below. Boxes are lined on the storage racks, each containing fragments of this silent layer, thin sections encased in resin, labelled in the ink that will outlast most memories. The compaction measured in laboratory silence, each index a slow distillation of what was once pressure, movement, and then nothing. These samples do not recount continuity. They assert a pause, a singularity, a surface constructed to endure, then made dormant, immune to the friction of passing time, untouched by further intent. In the records, the fills above are described with lexical restraint. Deposited, spread, placed, no energy of intrusion, no record of vital disturbance. And so, the earth beneath these central rooms holds its breath. The records are a catalogue of stillness, not a diary of endless commotion. Absence is preserved as much as presence. What is missing from the crushed horizon is the story, and that too is evidence. Silence, for once, outlasts use. The compaction is not the product of time's steady grind, but of an act chosen and then held fast. Each artifact, each annotated slide, carries forward the unsettled question that resists comfort. What compelled the builders to fix and preserve that compacted horizon beneath their most guarded spaces? You began in stillness, and you end among layers. The dust and clay of these accounts settle into an inheritance, records that outlast practices, sealed caches that outlast questions, thresholds closed to the curious. The evidence speaks with restraint. Its weight asks something of us. We are, in these terms, caretakers, keepers of a stratified memory that is older than our curiosity and quieter than our tools. Reflect on what it means to preserve rather than to reveal. If you found value in this measured listening, subscribe and place a like as a modest ritual of return.